Africans raising arms against Africans again. This is the stark reality facing West Africa today. A deep and dangerous fissure has opened up across the Sahel. Now, a new conflict looms, one that pits brother against brother, nation against nation. The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, has drawn a line in the sand, threatening military intervention. It represents a fundamental battle for the soul of West Africa. On one side stands ECOWAS, and on the other, a new alliance of military-led states charting a new path. A military conflict would unleash catastrophic consequences, destabilizing an already fragile region. This documentary, Insight Africa, will take you to the heart of this crisis. The Alliance of Sahel States, or AES, binds together Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Officially formed in September 2023, the alliance responded to intervention threats from ECOWAS. Its principle, an attack on one is an attack on all. The leaders portray their union as a reclamation of sovereignty. They speak a language of Pan-Africanism and self-reliance, pointing to foreign interference as the root cause of instability. In January 2024, the three nations announced their withdrawal from ECOWAS, accusing it of betraying its principles. This has galvanized significant popular support, viewing the alliance as a movement for true independence. The warning from Abuja, Nigeria was a direct challenge after the military takeover in Niger. ECOWAS leaders convened, patience thin after coups in Mali and Burkina Faso. They issued an ultimatum: restore President Bazoum within a week. Failure would lead to all necessary measures, including force. ECOWAS activated its standby force, planning for potential military action. The ultimatum was backed by economic and financial sanctions, cutting off Niger. This transformed the crisis into a regional powder keg with a firm deadline. The world watched as the clock ticked. As the ultimatum echoed from Abuja, the physical manifestation of the threat began to take shape along the borders. Maps on news channels lit up, showing the strategic frontiers between Niger and its ECOWAS neighbors, particularly Nigeria to the south and Benin to the southwest. These were not just lines on a map. They were lifelines for the landlocked nation of Niger, conduits for trade, and home to communities with deep cross-border ethnic and economic ties. Suddenly, these familiar landscapes were transformed into potential front lines. News reports showed footage of Nigerian and Beninese military units being put on higher alert, their movements tracked by satellite imagery and local sources, painting a picture of a region mobilizing for war. The military preparations were deliberate and highly visible. ECOWAS wanted the junta in Niamey and the world to see its readiness to act. The ECOWAS Standby Force, a multinational contingent designed for peacekeeping and intervention, was being prepared for its most challenging mission to date. Top military commanders spoke of their duty to uphold the regional charter, framing the potential intervention as a necessary police action to restore legality and prevent the further spread of instability across the fragile Sahel region. This mobilization, however, also revealed the deep divisions within the regional bloc itself. While the leadership in Nigeria, Senegal, and Ivory Coast were the most vocal proponents of intervention, other member states expressed profound reservations. The threat exposed fault lines that had long existed beneath the surface of ECOWAS unity. For nations sharing long, porous borders with the AES bloc, the prospect of a regional war was terrifying. They understood that any conflict would not be contained within Niger's borders. It would inevitably spill over, bringing with it waves of refugees, disrupting local economies, and creating a security vacuum that could be exploited by the very jihadist groups all nations were fighting against. The line drawn in the sand by ECOWAS was therefore a high-risk gamble. It was an attempt to enforce a collective principle, but it risked shattering the very collective it sought to protect. The border areas, once symbols of regional integration and shared culture, became zones of heightened tension and anxiety. Communities that had intermarried and traded for centuries now looked across the frontier with apprehension. The military posturing was intended to project strength and resolve, but on the ground, it sowed fear and uncertainty. The warning had been issued and the troops were preparing, but the question of whether they would actually cross that line remained perilously unanswered. The most chilling aspect of the ECOWAS threat was Africans preparing to take up arms against fellow Africans. This prospect evoked dark memories of past civil wars that had scarred the continent. The term Fratricidal War, a war between brothers, began to circulate widely in media reports. The idea of soldiers fighting against each other was a betrayal of the Pan-African dream of unity. Protests were organized in opposition to the war, reflecting a deep-seated desire to avoid bloodshed. They framed the ECOWAS threat as an act of external aggression, orchestrated by neo-colonial powers. Any military action against Niger would be considered a declaration of war against them as well. The ECOWAS warning had instead set the stage for a potentially devastating regional conflict. As ECOWAS issued its threats, a defiant counter-move was already taking shape in the Sahel. The military leaders of Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger understood that standing alone was no longer an option. They saw the ultimatum against Niger as a direct threat to their own survival. The pressure from ECOWAS acted as a catalyst, accelerating the formation of a new, formidable bloc built on the principle of collective security. This union was formalized with the signing of the Liptako-Gourma Charter, establishing the Alliance of Sahel States, or AES. The charter was more than just a piece of paper. It was a solemn vow. Its most critical component stated that any attack on one member would be considered an aggression against all. This mutual defense clause was a direct answer to the ECOWAS threat of intervention. The pact was forged in the fire of a shared crisis. The formation of the AES was triggered by the events in Niger, but its roots run much deeper. The leaders presented the AES as a homegrown solution to a regional problem. They spoke of a brotherhood of arms, united in a common struggle against terrorism and external domination. It was a strategic masterstroke that fundamentally altered the balance of power. To understand the appeal of the AES, one must look back. The borders of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger were drawn by French colonial administrators. For decades, these territories were exploited as part of French West Africa. Independence in 1960 did not sever these ties completely. France maintained significant influence, a relationship many viewed as neo-colonialism. This historical grievance is a deep wound, tapped into by the new military leaders. The juntas rode this wave of anti-French sentiment to power, promising an African-led security strategy. This message has galvanized a generation who feel held back by a system benefiting outsiders. Protesters reject the historical dominance of Paris and the West. The same external forces that colonized them are now crushing their attempt at genuine independence. This turned the AES into a symbol of resistance against a painful history. The rise of the AES is not just a military or political story, it is fundamentally about economic sovereignty. The leaders and their supporters argue that political independence is meaningless without control over one's own natural resources. The Sahel is a region rich in gold, uranium, and other valuable minerals, yet its people remain among the poorest on Earth. The juntas have blamed this paradox on exploitative deals signed by previous governments, which they claim funneled wealth out of Africa and into the pockets of foreign corporations. A core promise of the new regimes is to revise these mining contracts and ensure that the nation's resources benefit the nation's people first. This ambition took on a new urgency following the ECOWAS sanctions. After the coup in Niger, the regional bloc, supported by the West, imposed crippling economic measures. Borders were closed, financial assets were frozen, and trade was halted. These sanctions were intended to suffocate the junta into submission, but they also inflicted severe hardship on the general population, causing shortages of food and medicine. This, in the eyes of the AES leaders, was proof that the existing economic system was being weaponized against them. Their response was to turn inward, strengthening economic ties among themselves and seeking new partners outside the traditional Western sphere. In January 2024, the alliance took its most dramatic step. In a coordinated announcement, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger declared their immediate withdrawal from ECOWAS. They accused the bloc of having strayed from the ideals of its founding fathers and Pan-Africanism, and of being under the influence of foreign powers. This historic exit was a declaration of economic independence. It signaled their intent to build a new regional framework, one that would prioritize their own development and insulate them from what they viewed as politically motivated economic coercion. It was a bold move to redraw the economic map of West Africa. The vision for this new economic bloc is still emerging, but its outlines are clear. It involves creating a self-sufficient union, potentially with a shared currency and a unified market that can negotiate with the outside world from a position of strength. By combining their markets and coordinating economic policy, the three nations hope to break their dependency on old trade routes and financial systems controlled by their adversaries. This economic defiance is a crucial element of their broader push for sovereignty. The rise of the AES is therefore a rebellion against not just a political order, but an entire economic system they believe has failed them for generations. Behind the declarations and threats lies a deep fear within ECOWAS. The rise of the AES is an existential threat to the established regional order and the influence of its most powerful members. For decades, ECOWAS has worked to establish itself as the primary authority in West Africa, undermining its hard-won authority. This fear is compounded by pressure from Western partners. ECOWAS leaders are caught in a difficult position. Furthermore, the ECOWAS leadership is aware of its own internal divisions. The fear is that if the bloc fails to act decisively, it could embolden other potential coup plotters. Ultimately, the motive for ECOWAS is one of self-preservation. The bloc's leaders see the military juntas in the Sahel as a dangerous political virus that threatens to spread. It is a desperate attempt to protect a political and economic system. At the heart of this rebellion are three military men, now the faces of a new assertive African sovereignty. In Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, one of the world's youngest leaders. In Mali, Colonel Assimi Goïta led 2 coups in less than a year, cementing his grip on power. The catalyst was General Abdurrahman Tiani in Niger. His coup created a contiguous belt of military-led states across the Sahel. These 3 leaders share a common background and a shared narrative of national salvation. They framed their takeovers as a necessary response to state failure and the inability of civilian governments to protect their people from jihadist violence. They are the new power players. The AES and ECOWAS standoff is a clash of generations and ideologies. The AES leaders, young military officers, represent a generation frustrated by a perceived lack of true independence. Their message of radical change resonates with the continent's youth. ECOWAS leaders are older, civilian politicians who champion multi-party democracy and alliances with the West. This divide manifests in contrasting approaches to governance. The AES prioritizes national sovereignty, seeking new partners like Russia. ECOWAS champions rule of law and traditional ties. This disagreement makes the conflict intractable, a battle between competing visions for West Africa's future. Beyond politics and strategy lies the devastating human cost of war. A conflict would be a messy, brutal struggle. Civilians would be the first victims. A regional war would multiply suffering exponentially. Cities could become battlegrounds, forcing families to flee, creating a refugee crisis. The economic consequences would be catastrophic, pushing fragile economies into collapse. Sanctions would halt the flow of essential goods like food, fuel, and medicine. War would shatter the social fabric of a region. This division would create deep wounds, sowing resentment for generations. A war would force young men to kill their brothers. The stakes are profoundly human. A war would be a collective failure, with no true victors. War looms over a region facing severe food insecurity. The Sahel is enduring recurrent droughts and desertification, making farming precarious. Millions rely on aid. Conflict would turn this into catastrophe, disrupting agriculture and access to land. Rural communities' survival would be obliterated, pushing millions towards starvation. Landlocked countries rely on imports. Border closures cause prices of basic commodities to skyrocket. War would sever supply chains, making aid delivery nearly impossible. The most vulnerable, women, children, displaced, would face dire consequences. This weaponization of food would create a humanitarian disaster, destroying productive capacity. War would turn migration routes deadly, decimating livestock and ruining families. This food crisis is a critical geopolitical factor. It is impossible to discuss the stakes of this crisis without acknowledging the long shadow of the West, particularly that of France. This historical context fuels anti-French sentiment in the region. Following coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, the new governments demanded the departure of French troops. For the juntas and their supporters, these withdrawals were celebrated as victories. This narrative overlooks the deep popular discontent with the failures of previous governments to provide basic security and economic opportunity. Many saw ECOWAS's threatened intervention as a proxy action driven by Western interests. The juntas see themselves as a legitimate response to a failed system sustained by Western patronage. They are now seeking new partners, like Russia and Iran, to counterbalance Western influence. This standoff is a key battleground in a wider global realignment. While leaders debate the region's fate, the true pulse is on the streets. In Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey, a powerful wave of popular support defines this standoff. These massive outpourings signal that the juntas enjoy a significant social base. Voices from the crowds express disillusionment with the past and hope for the future. Pan-African bloggers and citizen journalists amplify this support, bypassing traditional media. They broadcast a message of sovereign pride and anti-imperialist defiance, framing the juntas as liberators. However, beneath the surface, there is also fear and anxiety about the suspension of constitutions and loss of freedoms. The crisis has reignited Pan-Africanism, inspiring hope for unity and self-determination across the Sahel. For AES supporters, this alliance is a bold step toward African solutions, breaking from the CFA franc and forging economic independence. Yet, in ECOWAS nations, fear overshadows hope. Many dread the prospect of war, knowing it could pit brother against brother. Social media debates and family divisions reveal how deep the crisis cuts, threatening the region's fragile social fabric. Some hail the juntas as liberators. Others see them as threats to peace. But nearly all agree, the old ways have failed. People are weary of insecurity and being pawns in global politics. The demand for change is real, and whatever the outcome, it will shape West Africa's future. Hope and fear now walk hand in hand as the Pan-African dream faces its greatest test. The best-case scenario is a negotiated settlement, painstaking diplomacy to avoid war. Elders and neutral states might mediate, seeking a compromise, a clear transition to civilian rule in exchange for lifting sanctions and ending threats of intervention. This would let both sides claim victory and refocus on fighting terrorism and poverty. But the positions have hardened. AES leaders, emboldened by support, refuse to negotiate away their power. ECOWAS, meanwhile, risks its credibility if it backs down without restoring ousted presidents. The result is a diplomatic stalemate, with both sides clinging to non-negotiable demands. The path of peace grows narrower by the day, fading beneath pride and irreconcilable differences. The nightmare scenario is a regional war, an ECOWAS intervention in Niger triggering a Sahel-wide conflict. AES allies would respond, opening multiple fronts and dragging West Africa into chaos. The Sahel's harsh terrain favors defenders, promising a long, bloody, asymmetric war. Jihadist groups would exploit the chaos, expanding their reach and deepening instability. Neighboring countries and global powers could be drawn in, turning the region into a proxy battleground. The human cost would be catastrophic. Millions displaced, economies shattered, a generation lost. Such a war would destabilize all of West Africa, exporting insecurity and collapse. Diplomats scramble to prevent this self-inflicted disaster, but the drums of war grow louder. Between war and peace lies a third path, a frozen conflict, a West African Cold War. The AES and ECOWAS blocs would harden, with borders, sanctions, and propaganda deepening the divide. The AES would turn to new partners, while ECOWAS clings to old alliances, both sides fueling mistrust. Trade routes would shift, economies would suffer, and the dream of regional integration would die. This standoff would entrench hardship and division, benefiting only extremists. The region would remain tense, its potential stifled by a bitter, enduring rivalry. Not open war, but a frozen conflict, leaving West Africa fractured and on edge. West Africa stands at a crossroads, facing choices that will echo for generations. The crisis is more than politics. It's a reckoning with colonial legacies and the meaning of sovereignty. The rise of the AES challenges the old order, forcing a debate on democracy, security, and self-determination. Is stability found in enforcing constitutional norms or in governments that command loyalty, however they arise? The confrontation exposes a raw struggle for West Africa's soul, between institutional order and revolutionary sovereignty. One path returns to familiar flawed systems, the other risks everything for a new beginning. The choice made now will define the continent's future. As this documentary comes to a close, the future of West Africa remains unwritten, balanced on a knife's edge between a fragile peace and a devastating war. The immediate crisis may evolve into a negotiated settlement, a protracted Cold War, or a catastrophic conflict, but the underlying forces it has unleashed will not disappear. The popular demand for genuine independence, economic justice, and effective security is now a permanent feature of the political landscape. Any future model of governance in the region, whether democratic or authoritarian, will be judged by its ability to meet these fundamental aspirations of its people, a populace that has shown it will no longer suffer in silence. The international community, particularly the West, faces a critical moment of reflection. A strategy based solely on condemning coups and imposing sanctions, without addressing the root causes of state failure and popular discontent that lead to them, has proven to be ineffective and even counterproductive. It has fueled anti-Western sentiment and pushed African nations to seek alternative partners. A more nuanced approach is required, one that listens to the grievances on the street, engages with the new realities of power, and supports African-led solutions that prioritize the long-term well-being of the population over the short-term preservation of a preferred political order. The final question is not whether the AES will survive or if ECOWAS will restore its authority. The bigger question is what this moment means for the future of African unity. Can the continent overcome these deep ideological divisions to forge a common path forward? Can the principles of Pan-Africanism be a bridge to unite a fractured region? Or will they become a weapon in a new era of intra-African rivalry? The answer will depend on the wisdom and restraint of leaders on both sides and on their ability to place the lives of their people above the politics of power and pride. The world is watching, but the consequences will be borne by Africans. In a region long divided by outsiders, three nations stand together and power trembles. This is Insight Africa, where unity turns threats into freedom.